Chapter 17. The Kids. The archipelago had many ugly mugs and many bared fangs. No matter what side you approached it from, there wasn't one you could admire. But perhaps the most abominable of all was that maw that swallowed up the kids. The kids were not at all those bezprizorniki, or waifs in drab tatters who scurried hither and thither, thieving and warming themselves at asphalt cauldrons on the streets, without whom one could not picture the urban life of the 20s. The waifs were taken from the streets, not from their families, into the colonies for the juvenile delinquents. There was one attached to People's Commissariat of Education as early as 1920, into workhouses for juveniles, which existed from 1921 to 1930 and had bars, bolts, and jailers, so that in the outworn bourgeois terminology they could have been called prisons, and also into the labor communes of the OGPU from 1924 on. They had been orphaned by the Civil War, by its famine, by social disorganization, the execution of their parents, or the death of the latter at the front. And at that time, justice really did try to return these children to the mainstream of life, removing them from their street apprenticeship as thieves. But where did the young offenders come from? They came from Article 12 of the Criminal Code of 1926, which permitted children from the age of 12 to be sentenced for theft, assault, mutilation, and murder. Article 58 offenses were also included under this heading. But they had to be given moderate sentences, not the whole works, like adults. Here was the first crawl hole into the archipelago for the future kids, but it was not yet a wide gate. We are not going to omit one interesting statistic. In 1927, prisoners aged 16, they didn't count the younger ones, to 24 represented 48% of all prisoners. What this amounts to is that nearly half the entire archipelago in 1927 consisted of youths whom the October Revolution had caught between the ages of 6 and 14. 10 years after the victorious revolution, these same girls and boys turned up in prison and constituted half the prison population. This jibes poorly with the struggle against the vestiges of the bourgeois consciousness, which we inherited from the old society. But figures are figures. They demonstrate that the archipelago never was short of young people. But the question of how young was decided in 1935. In that year, the great evildoer once more left his thumbprint on history's submissive clay. Among such deeds as the destruction of Leningrad and the destruction of his own party, he did not overlook the children whom he loved so well, whose best friend he was, and with whom he therefore had his photograph taken. Seeing no other way to bridle those insidious mischief-makers, those washerwomen's brats, who were overrunning the country in thicker and thicker swarms and growing more and more brazen in their violations of socialist legality, he invented a gift for them. These children, from 12 years of age, by this time his beloved daughter was approaching that borderline, and he could see that age tangibly before his eyes, should be sentenced to the whole works in the code, including capital punishment as well. Illiterates that we were, we scrutinized decrees very little at the time. More and more we gazed at the portraits of Stalin with a black-haired little girl in his arms. Even less did the 12-year-olds read the decrees, and the decrees kept coming out, one after another. On December 10th, 1940, the sentencing of juveniles from the age of 12 for putting various objects on railroad tracks. This was training young diversionists. On May 31st, 1941, it was decreed that for all other varieties of crime not included in Article 12, juveniles were to be given full sentences from the age of 14 on. But here a small obstacle arose. The war of the fatherland began. But the law is the law, and on July 7th, 1941, 4 days after Stalin's panicky speech in the days when the German tanks were driving toward Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev, one more decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet was issued, and it is difficult now to say in what respect it is more interesting for us today, in its unwavering academic character, showing what important questions were being decided by the government in those flaming days, or in its actual contents. The situation was that the prosecutor of the USSR, Vyshinsky, had complained to the Supreme Soviet about the Supreme Court, which means His Graciousness had heard about the matter, because the courts were applying the decree of 1935 incorrectly, and these brats were being sentenced only when they had intentionally committed crimes. But this was impermissible softness, and so right in the heat of the war, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet elucidated. This interpretation does not correspond to the text of the law. It introduces limitations not provided for by the law, and in agreement with the prosecutor, the Presidium issued a clarification to the Supreme Court. Children must be sentenced and the full measure of punishment applied. In other words, the whole works, even in cases where crimes were committed not intentionally, but as a result of carelessness. Now that is something. Perhaps in all the world history, no one has yet approached such a radical solution of the problem of children. From 12 years on for carelessness, up to and including execution. And that is when all the escape holes were shut off to the greedy mice. That is when, finally, all the collective farm ears of grain were saved, and now the granaries were going to be filled to overflowing and life would flourish, and children who had been bad from birth would be set on the long path of correction. And none of the party prosecutors with children the same age shuddered. They found no problem in stamping the arrest warrants, and none of the party judges shuddered either. With bright eyes they sentenced little children to 3, 5, 8, and 10 years in general camps. And for shearing sheaves, these tykes got not less than 8 years. And for a pocketful of potatoes, 1 pocketful of potatoes in a child's trousers, they also got 8 years. Cucumbers did not have so high a value put on them. For a dozen cucumbers, Sasha Blokhin got 5 years. And the hungry 14-year-old girl, Lida, in the Chungurlo district center of Kustanai province, walked down the street, picking up, mixed with the dust, a narrow train of grain spilled from a truck, doomed to go to waste in any case. For this she was sentenced to only 3 years, because of the alleviating circumstances that she had not taken socialist property directly from the field or from the barn. And perhaps what also inclined the judges to be less harsh was that in that same year of 1948, there had been a clarification of the Supreme Court to the effect that children need not be tried for theft, which had the character of childish mischief, such as the petty theft of apples in an orchard. By analogy, the court drew the conclusion here that it was possible to be just a wee bit less harsh. But the conclusion we draw is that from 1935 to 1948, children were sentenced for taking apples. And a great many were sentenced for running away from the factory apprenticeship training. True, they only got 6 months for that. In camp they were jokingly called death row prisoners. But joke or no joke, here is a scene with some such death row prisoners in a Far Eastern camp. They were assigned to dump the shit from latrines. There was a cart with 2 enormous wheels and an enormous barrel on it, full of stinking sludge. The death row prisoners were hitched up, with many of them in the shafts and others pushing from the sides and from behind. The barrel kept swaying and splashing them. And the crimson-cheeked bitches in their twill suits roared with laughter as they urged the children on with clubs. And on a prisoner transport ship from Vladivostok to Sakhalin in 1949, the bitches used these children at knife point for carnal enjoyment. So even 6 months was sometimes enough, too. And it was then that 12-year-olds crossed the thresholds of the adult prison cells, were equated with adults as citizens possessing full rights. Equated by virtue of the most savage prison terms, equated, in their whole unconscious life, by bread rations, bowls of gruel, their places on the sleeping shelves. That is when that old term of communist re-education, minors, somehow lost its significance, when the outlines of its meaning faded, became unclear, and Gulag itself gave birth to the ringing and impudent word, kids. And with a proud and bitter intonation, these bitter citizens began to use this term to describe themselves. Not yet citizens of the country, but already citizens of the archipelago. So early and so strangely did their adulthood begin, with this step across the prison threshold. And upon the 12- and 14-year-old heads burst a lifestyle that was too much for brave men who were experienced and mature. But the young people, by the laws of their young life, were not about to be flattened by this lifestyle, but instead grew into it and adapted to it. Just as new languages and new customs are learned without difficulty in childhood, so the juveniles adopted, on the run, both the language of the archipelago, which was that of the thieves, and the philosophy of the archipelago. And whose philosophy was that? From this life they took for themselves all its most inhuman essence, all its poisonous rotten juice, and as readily as if it had been this liquid, and not milk, that they had sucked from their mothers' breasts in infancy. And as readily as it had been this liquid, and not milk, that they had sucked from their mothers' breasts in infancy. They grew into camp life so swiftly, not in weeks even, but in days, as if they were not in the least surprised by it, as if that life were not completely new to them, but a natural continuation of their free life of yesterday. Even out in freedom they hadn't grown up in linens and velvets. It had not been the children of secure and powerful parents who had gone out to clip stalks of grain, filled their pockets with potatoes, been late at the factory gate, or run away from factory apprenticeship training. The kids were the children of workers. Out in freedom they had understood very well that life was built upon injustice. But out there things had not been laid out stark and bare to the last extremity. Some of it was dressed up in decent clothing, some of it softened by a mother's kind word. In the archipelago the kids saw the world as it is seen by quadrupeds. Only might makes right. Only the beast of prey has the right to live. That is how we, too, in our adult years, saw the archipelago. But we were capable of counterposing to it all of our experience, our thoughts, our ideals, and everything that we had read to that very day. Children accepted the archipelago with a divine impressionability of childhood, and in a few days children became beasts there, and the worst kind of beasts, with no ethical concepts whatever. The kid masters the truth. If other teeth are weaker than your own, then tear the piece away from them. It belongs to you. There were two basic methods of maintaining kids in the archipelago. In separate children's colonies, principally the younger kids, not yet 15, and in mixed category camps, most often with invalids and women, the senior kids. Both were equally successful in developing animal viciousness, and neither rescued the kids from being educated in the spirit of the thieves' ideals. Take Yura Yermolov. He reports that when he was only 12 years old, in 1942, he saw a great deal of fraud, thievery, and speculation going on around him, and arrived at the following judgment about life. The only people who do not steal and deceive are those who are afraid to. As for me, I don't want to be afraid of anything, which means that I too will steal and deceive and live well. And yet for a time his life somehow developed differently. He became fascinated by the shining examples of whose spirit he was taught in school. However, having got a taste of the beloved father at the age of 14, he wrote a leaflet. "Down with Stalin! Hail Lenin!" They caught him on that one, beat him up, gave him 5810, and imprisoned him with the kids and thieves. And Yura Yermolov quickly mastered the thieves' law. The spirit of his existence spiraled upwards steeply, and at the age of 14 he had executed his negation of a negation. He had returned to the concept of thievery as the highest and best of all existence. And what did he see in the children's colony? There was even more injustice than in freedom. The chiefs and the jailers lived off the state, shielded by the correctional system. Part of the kids' ration went from the kitchen into the bellies of the instructors. The kids were beaten with boots, kept in fear so that they would be silent and obedient. The simplest reply to the overpowering injustices was to create injustices oneself. This was the easiest conclusion, and it would now become the rule of life of the kids for a long time to come. or even forever. But here is what's interesting. In giving the cruel world battle, the kids didn't battle against one another. They didn't look on each other as enemies. They entered this struggle as a collective, a united group. Was this a budding socialism? The indoctrination of the instructors? Oh, come on. Cut the cackle, big mouths. This is a descent into the law of thieves. After all, the thieves are united. After all, the thieves have their own discipline and their own ringleaders. And the juveniles were the apprentices of the thieves. They were mastering the precepts of their elders. No one could avoid being cooked up in that mash. No boy could remain a separate individual. He would be trampled, torn apart, ostracized, if he did not immediately declare himself a thieves' apprentice. And all of them took that inevitable oath. Reader, put your own children in that place. Who was the enemy of the kids in the children's colonies? The jailers and the instructors. The struggle was against them. Say they were marching a column of kids under armed guard through a city, and it seems even shameful to guard the children so strictly. Far from it, they had worked out a plan, a whistle, and all who wanted to scattered in different directions. And what were the guards to do? Shoot? At whom? At children? And so their prison terms came to an end. In one fell swoop, 150 years ran away from the state. You don't enjoy looking silly? Then don't arrest children. Here is one of their boastful stories about themselves, which, knowing the typical pattern of the kids' actions, I fully believe. Some excited and frightened children ran to the nurse of a children's colony and summoned her to help one of their comrades who was seriously ill. Forgetting caution, she quickly accompanied them to their big cell for 40. And as soon as she was inside, the whole anthill went into action. Some of them barricaded the door and kept watch. Dozens of hands tore everything off her, all the clothes she had on, and toppled her over. And then some sat on her hands and on her legs, and then, everyone doing what they could and where, they raped her, kissed her, bit her. It was against orders to shoot them, and no one could rescue her until they themselves let her go, profaned and weeping. In general, of course, interest in the female body begins early among boys, and in the kids' cells it was intensely heated up by colorful stories and boasting, and they never let a chance go by to let off steam. Here is an episode. In broad daylight, in full view of everyone, 4 kids were sitting in the compound of Krivoshkakovo Camp No. 1, talking with a girl called Lyuba from the bookbinding shop. She retorted sharply to something they had said. The boys leaped up, grabbed her legs, and lifted them in the air. She was in a defenseless position. While she supported herself on the ground with her hands, her skirt fell over her head. The boys held her that way and caressed her with their free hands. And then they let her down, and not roughly either. Did she slap them? Did she run away from them? Not at all. She sat down just as before and continued the argument. These were 16-year-old kids, and it was an adult camp with mixed categories. It was the same one that had the women's barracks for 500, where all the copulation took place without curtains and which the kids used to enter importantly like men. In the children's colonies, the kids worked for 4 hours and then were supposed to be in school for 4. But all that schooling was a fake. When transferred to an adult camp, they had a 10-hour workday, except that their work norms were reduced, while their ration norms were the same as adults. They were transferred at the age of 16, but their undernourishment and improper development in camp and before camp endowed them at that age with the appearance of small, frail children. Their height was stunted, as were their minds and their interests. After the children's colony, their situation changed drastically. No longer did they get the children's ration which so tempted the jailers, and therefore the latter ceased to be their principal enemy. Some old men appeared in their lives on whom they could try their strength. Women appeared on whom they could try their maturity. Some real live thieves appeared, fat-faced camp stormtroopers, who willingly undertook their guidance both in world outlook and in training in thievery. To learn from them was tempting, and not to learn from them was impossible. For a free reader, does the word thief perhaps sound like a reproach? In that case, he has understood nothing. This word is pronounced in the underworld in the same way that the word knight was pronounced among the nobility, and with greater esteem, and not loudly but softly like a sacred word. To become a worthy thief some day was the kid's dream. On one occasion at the Ivanovo transit prison, I spent the night in a cell for kids. In the next bunk to me was a thin boy just over 15, called Slava, I think. It appeared to me that he was going through the whole kid ritual somehow unwillingly, as if he were growing out of it or was weary of it. I thought to myself, this boy has not perished and is more intelligent, and he will soon move away from the others, and we had a chat. The boy came from Kiev. One of his parents had died, and the other had abandoned him. Before the war, at the age of 9, Slava began to steal. He also stole when our army came. And after the war, and with a sad, thoughtful smile, which was so old for 15, he explained to me that in the future, too, he intended to live only by thievery. You know, he explained to me very reasonably, that as a worker you can earn only bread and water, and my childhood was so bad that I want to live well. What did you do during the German occupation? I asked, trying to fill in the 2 years he had bypassed without describing them, the 2 years of the occupation of Kiev. He shook his head. Under the Germans I worked. What do you think? That I could have gone on stealing under the Germans? They shot you on the spot for that. Here, as recounted by A. Y. Susi, are several pictures from Krivoshekovo penalty, Camp No. 2 of Novosiblag. Life was lived in enormous half-dark dugouts for 500 each, which had been dug into the earth to a depth of 5 feet. The chiefs did not interfere with the life inside the compound. No slogans and no lectures. The thieves and kids held sway. Almost no one was taken out to work. Rations were correspondingly meager. On the other hand, there was a surplus of time. One day they were bringing a bread box from the bread-cutting room under the guard of brigade members. The kids started a fake fight in front of the box itself, started shoving one another, and tipped the box over. The brigade members hurled themselves on the bread ration to pick it up from the ground. Out of 20 rations, they managed to save only 14. The fighting kids were nowhere to be seen. The mess hall at this camp was a plank lean-to, not adequate for the Siberian winter. The gruel and the bread ration had to be carried about 150 yards in the cold from the kitchen to the dugout. For the elderly invalids, this was a dangerous and difficult operation. They pushed their bread ration far down inside their shirt and gripped their mess tin with freezing hands. But suddenly, with diabolical speed, 2 or 3 kids would attack from the side. They knocked one old man to the ground. 6 hands frisked him all over, and they made off like a whirlwind. His bread ration had been pilfered, his gruel spilled, his empty mess tin lay there on the ground, and the old man struggled to get to his knees. And other zeks saw this and hastily bypassed the dangerous spot, hurrying to carry their own bread rations to the dugout. And the weaker their victim, the more merciless were the kids. They openly tore the bread ration from the hands of a very weak old man. The old man wept and implored them to give it back to him. "I am dying of starvation." "So you're going to kick the bucket soon anyway. What's the difference?" And the kids once decided to attack the invalids in the cold, empty building in front of the kitchen where there was always a mob of people. The gang would hurl their victim to the ground, sit on his hands, his legs, and his head, search his pockets, take his makorka and his money, and then disappear. It was enough for a careless free worker to go into the camp compound with a dog and turn his head for 1 second, and he could buy his dog's pelt that very same evening outside the camp compound. The dog would have been coaxed away, knifed, skinned, and cooked, all in a trice. Their ears simply didn't admit anything that they themselves didn't need. If irritated old men started to grab them and pull them up short, the kids would hurl heavy objects at them. The kids found amusement in just about anything. They would grab the field shirt off an elderly invalid and play keep-away, forcing him to run back and forth just as if he were their own age. Does he become angry and leave? Then he will never see it again. They will have sold it outside the compound for a smoke, and they will even come up to him afterward innocently. "Papasha, give us a light." "Oh, come on now, don't be angry. Why did you leave? Why didn't you stay and catch it?" For adults, fathers and grandfathers, these boisterous games of the kids in the crowded conditions of camp would cause more anguish and be more hurtful than their robbing and their rapacious greed. It proved to be one of the most sensitive forms of humiliation for an elderly person, to be made equal with a young whippersnapper, if only it were equal, but not to be turned over to the tyranny of the whippersnappers. That is how small, stubborn fascists were trained by the joint action of Stalinist legislation, a Gulag education, and the leaven of the thieves. It was impossible to invent a better method of brutalizing children. It was quite impossible to find a quicker, stronger way of implanting all the vices of camp in tiny, immature hearts. Even when it would have cost nothing to soften the heart of a child, the camp bosses didn't permit it. This was not the goal of their training. At Krivoshikovo Camp No. 1, a boy asked to be transferred so that he could be with his father in Camp No. 2. This was not permitted. After all, the rules required families be broken up, and the boy had to hide in a barrel to get from one camp to the other and lived there with his father in secret. And in their confusion, they assumed he had escaped and used a stick with spikes made of nails to poke about in the latrine pits to see whether or not he had drowned there. Stalin's immortal laws on kids existed for 20 years, until the decree of April 24th, 1954, which relaxed them slightly, releasing those kids who had served more than 1/3 of their first term. And what if they were 14? 20 years, 20 harvests, and 20 different age groups had been maimed with crime and depravity. So who dares cast a shadow on the memory of our great Coryphaeus? There were nimble children who managed to catch Article 58 very early in life. For example, Jelly Pavlov got it at 12. From 1943 to 1949, he was imprisoned in the colony in Zakhovsk. For Article 58, in fact, no minimum age existed. That is what they said, even in public lectures on jurisprudence. As, for example, in Tallinn in 1945, Dr. Usma knew a 6-year-old boy imprisoned in a colony under 58. But that, evidently, is the record. And where, if not at this chapter, are we going to mention the children orphaned by the arrest of their parents? The children of the women of the religious commune near Kosta were fortunate. When their mothers were sent off to Solovki in 1929, the children were soft-heartedly left in their own homes and on their own farms. The children looked after the orchards and vegetable gardens themselves, milked their goats, assiduously studied at school, and sent their school grades to their parents on Solovki, together with assurances that they were prepared to suffer for God as their mothers had. And of course, the party soon gave them this opportunity. Considering the instructions to disunite exiled children and their parents, how many of these kids must there have been even back in the 20s? And who will ever tell us of their fate? Even a superficial glance reveals one characteristic. The children, too, were destined for imprisonment. They, too, in their turn, would be sent off to the promised land of the archipelago, sometimes even at the same time as their parents. Take the 8th grader Nina Perugud. In November 1941, they came to arrest her father. There was a search. Suddenly Nina remembered that inside the stove lay a crumpled but not yet burned humorous rhyme, and it might have just stayed there, but out of nervousness Nina decided to tear it up at once. She reached into the firebox, and the dozing policeman grabbed her, and this horrible sacrilege in a schoolgirl's handwriting was revealed to the eyes of the Chekists. The stars in heaven are shining down, and their light falls on the dew. Smolensk is already lost and gone, and we're going to lose Moscow too. And she expressed the desire. We only wish they'd bomb the school. We're awfully tired of studies. Naturally, these full-grown men engaged in saving their motherland deep in the rear in Tambov. These knights with hot hearts and clean hands had to scotch such a mortal danger, Nina was arrested. Confiscated for her interrogation were her diaries from the 6th grade and a counter-revolutionary photograph, a snapshot of the destroyed Vaverenskaya church. "What did your father talk about?" cried the knights with their hot hearts. Nina only sobbed. They sentenced her to 5 years of imprisonment and 3 years deprivation of civil rights, even though she couldn't lose them since she didn't yet have them. In camp, of course, she was separated from her father. Oh, you corrupters of young souls, how prosperously are you living out your lives? You are never going to have to stand up somewhere, blushing and tongue-tied, and confess what slops you poured over souls. But Zoya Lesheva managed to outdo her whole family, and here is how. Her father, her mother, her grandfather, her grandmother, and her elder adolescent brothers had all been scattered to distant camps because of their faith in God. But Zoya was a mere 10 years old. They took her to an orphanage in Ivanovo province, and there she declared she would never remove the cross from around her neck, the cross which her mother had hung there when she said farewell, and she tied the knot of the cord tighter so they would not be able to remove it when she was asleep. The struggle went on and on for a long time. Zoya became enraged. "You can strangle me and then take it off a corpse." Then she was sent to an orphanage for retarded children, because she would not submit to their training. And in that orphanage were the dregs, a category of kids worse than anything described in this chapter. The struggle for the cross went on and on. Zoya stood her ground. Even here she refused to learn to steal or to curse. "A mother as sacred as mine must never have a daughter who is a criminal. I would rather be a political, like my whole family." And she became a political. And the more her instructors and the radio praised Stalin, the more clearly she saw him the culprit responsible for all their misfortunes. And, refusing to give in to the criminals, she now began to win them over to her views. In the courtyard stood one of those mass-produced plaster statues of Stalin, and mocking and indecent graffiti began to appear on it. Kids love sport. The important thing is to point them in the right direction. The administration kept repainting the statue, kept watch over it, and reported the situation to the MGB. And the graffiti kept on appearing, and the kids kept on laughing. Finally, one morning, they found that the statue's head had been knocked off and turned upside down, and inside it were feces. This was a terrorist act. The MGB came, and began, in accordance with all their rules, their interrogations and threats. "Turn over the gang of terrorists to us, otherwise we are going to shoot the lot of you for terrorism." And there would have been nothing remarkable if they had. So what? 150 children shot. If he himself had known about it, he would himself have given the order. It's not known whether the kids would have stood up to them or given in, but Zoya Lesheva declared, "I did it all myself. What else is the head of that papa good for?" And she was tried, and she was sentenced to the supreme measure, no joke. But because of the intolerable humanitarianism of the 1950 law on the restoration of capital punishment, the execution of a 14-year-old was forbidden, and therefore they gave her a termer. It's surprising it wasn't 25. Up to the age of 18, she was in ordinary camps, and from the age of 18 on, she was in special camps. For her directness and her language, she got a second camp sentence, and it seems, a third one as well. Zoya's parents had already been freed, and her brothers too, but Zoya languished on in camp. Long live our tolerance of religion. Long live our children, the masters of communism. And let any country speak up that can say it has loved its children as we have ours. End of Part 3, Chapter 17.